two. Then there's a pair of us.
Hello, creative people. Thanks for tuning in to Melody or Witchcraft. I'm your host, Catherine Petrocelli. On the podcast, we hear a poet read a work of their own and an Emily Dickinson poem of their choosing that contributed to their work. We discuss poetry, Dickinson, the fluidity of time, and the scope and sources of creative inspiration. The past is such a curious creature, Dickinson wrote. Join us to find out how it can teach us about our now.
You know how dreary to be somebody.
I cannot live with you. It would be life, and life is over there behind the shelf. The Sexton keeps the key to putting up our life, his porcelain, like a cup, discarded of the housewife, quaint or broke, a newer Sevres pleases, old ones crack. I could not die with you, for one must wait to shut the other's gaze down. You could not, and could I stand by and see you freeze without my right of frost, death, privilege? Nor could I rise with you, because your face would put out Jesus's, that new grace glow plain and foreign on my homesick eye, except that you than he shone closer by. They judge us, how? For you served heaven, you know or sought to. I could not, because you saturated sight, and I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise. And were you lost, I would be, though my name rang loudest on the heavenly fame. And were you saved, and I condemned to be, where you were not, that self were hell to me. So we must meet apart, you there, I here, with just the door ajar that oceans are, and prayer, and that white sustenance, despair.
That was Victoria Kennefick reading Emily Dickinson. Dr. Victoria Kennefick is a writer, poet, editor, and teacher who lives in Tralee, County Kerry, Ireland. She completed a PhD in Irish and American literature at University of College Cork and was a Fulbright Scholar at Emory University. Her debut collection, Eat or We Both Starve, Carcanet Press 2021, won the Seamus Heaney First Collection Poetry Prize and the Dalkey Book Festival Emerging Writer of the Year. Her second collection, Eggshell, Carcanet Press 2024, was a Poetry Book Society choice and won the Farmgate Cafe National Poetry Prize 2025. She was the 2025 Arts Council of Ireland Trinity College Dublin Writer Fellow. Hi, Victoria. Welcome.
Hello, Catherine. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely lovely to have you. This poem is such an amazing example of how Dickinson turns and turns and turns the facets. And we're getting that kind of process of elimination by negation and then end with, gosh, what is it? The hyperbolic close.
Despair.
And that white sustenance. Despair. When you read Dickinson love poetry, and I feel like this one at least seems to match in intensity the master letters as well. Where do you go? What does it bring up for you in particular?
Well, I'm fascinated, like all of us, with Emily Dickinson's internal landscape and how she translates it for us, particularly when it comes to relationships, and particularly given she didn't follow the quote unquote traditional path that was, I suppose, expected by society of that time for women. And that had obviously massive implications for the way that she communicates. I am always fascinated by the fact there is no compromise in how she communicates. There is no people pleasing. There is no effort to be understood. And when I think of my own work and when I think even of my own relationships, what really characterizes so much of my motivation is that desire to be understood and be heard. And so I'm fascinated by her defiance of that and how gloriously she inhabits this Emily Dickinson's space. As much as she was involved with her family, in as much as she was involved in her community, in very traditional domestic ways, baking and so on, in this space, she is the supreme goddess of it all. And I just fascinated at looking at that in form and in content, but also as a woman navigating passion and love, because I think she possibly was one of the most passionate people ever to have existed. Like, as you said earlier when we were briefly chatting, a lightning rod for the intensity of human experience. And where do you put that?
Right. Yeah. You put it in 1789 poems, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just gorgeous. One of the sections that just blows me away in a few lines, she covers Jesus and resurrection, longing for earthly life, and then a love so strong that it rejects all of the above. So we get, nor could I rise with you because your face would put out Jesus's, that new grace, glow plain and foreign on my homesick eye. It's right in the middle. It's right at the sort of peak of things in the poem itself. Such
I
blasphemy.
know. Go, Emily.
No wonder this woman didn't publish in her lifetime. I mean, can you imagine?
It is glorious and so defiant. And that sense, I suppose, that this man is just so heavenly and divine that he surpasses Jesus. And as you say, what an extraordinary act for somebody living in such a conservative Christian community, having grown up in that landscape, and just absolutely gloriously and gleefully, in some way, rejecting it because of the ferocity of her physical, emotional, psychological, almost spiritual desire for this other person that surpasses any sort of faith or any sort of belief in a more divine love, which again is so brave and courageous. Her nervous system, I just feel like her nerves were on the outside of her body, that she was really trying to always manage the intensity of her own responses to the world around her.
Yeah, living in her own body, in her own mind, seeing how apart that was. Never mind the reclusivity, never mind, yes, faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see. Yes, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. We could just explain Dickinson through Dickinson over the next, 40 minutes. It's breathtaking to kind of read line for line sometimes and knowing her context. And that's maybe the advantage of reading someone from the past where we have a bit of a bird's eye view. We're not in it ourselves. When we read sordid excellence as paradise, we can go, knowing all the things that you just spoke about, knowing that New England 19th century Christian context.
I think that's such a brilliant point and something that can be hard to remember as you're reading the work, obviously, with our context and our contemporary gaze, the fact that, she was dangerous in many respects as a woman writing in this way, feeling these things, having this massive intellect, as well as most profound emotional intelligence, and also having the self-awareness that she needed to be in some way in the next room to everything, because her intensity and indeed her experience of the room would be to such a degree that it almost becomes unbearable. I get a sense from this poem so much of like, how would I manage myself with you? How would I manage to survive as a quote unquote, again, normal person with you burning beside me? Where I think sometimes that is where poetry comes in that it is, for some poets, a channel, and artists indeed, and this sense that I can't do this to us, and obviously there is the sense that it might not have been possible, suggesting that it's the Reverend that she may be discussing here. But even if that's the case, it's almost like the best I can get and the most exquisite version of this relationship is by not being together. And there's something in our modern parlance as well around avoidance in relationships. The idea of how well and good for Emily Dickinson to discuss all of this, but what would it have been like, to have breakfast with this person or discuss the politics of the day or have an argument about the temperature in the house. These are things that she doesn't, obviously in her domestic life at home with her family, she does, but doesn't seem to allow herself, or doesn't feel able, or doesn't feel safe, or is afraid to, I suppose, diffuse this intensity through the medium of the mundane.
Oh, I like that idea a lot. Yeah, afraid to diffuse the intensity. That's a really wonderful thing to think about. But I'm so glad you brought up this idea of her as dangerous, because I just had a conversation with the poet Dana Levin, that this idea of a woman who knows her own power as a threat was a theme that kind of ran through what we spoke about. It is very true, and we can extend it. I mean, this poem might be speaking to that, Reverend, and I will put it in the show notes for anyone interested in what that's hinting at. But it could have been other people. We suspect she loved women, she loved men. One more way that she was so far outside of the box for her time. Not the safest path, and not the comfortable person for her peers to interact with necessarily.
Absolutely. And it's kind of fascinating to think about, this potency that she had, this intensity, this genius, obvious genius that she embodied in every respect, being uncategorizable. There was no way of putting her into any sort of preordained role or box. Even the idea that she was a recluse, and yet she was very involved, as I said earlier, in baking and, being part of like the joyful domestic endeavors of her household, very close to her father. So she doesn't fit into that, like, oh, she was cold and distant. She wasn't. And when you think of somebody like Walt Whitman, a contemporary of hers, who was a man who didn't fit in that particular framework, either that men are I was going to say provided with, but it's all like shoved in our faces. It's just, thrown at us. His approach to that is her opposite when you think about him shouting at the traffic, and his lengthy book length poems, the endless writing and speaking and publishing, that they were two sides of almost a polarity in their genius, in their expressing what was so toxic, I suppose, about the society that they were growing up in and living in, that was just so restrictive. But Emily's potency was so much more than Whitman's. It had to be like contained, like it couldn't be even seen, whereas his was bombastic and available because that was allowed. There was space for that.
Well, yeah, and in terms of Emily, her brother Austin, there is evidence certainly when he was younger that his personality maybe leaned like hers. But of course, like you say, there were no choices, right? Of course, he became a lawyer. That's what his father was. That's what he was meant to do. Of course, he took over his father's civic duties in the community afterwards. And from all accounts, it seems like he grew rather bitter, right? He wanted to be planting trees, nothing for nothing.
That poets kind of are those figures who manage to bypass that expectation. I often think of Seamus Heaney in his first book, Death of a Naturalist, and one of his first poems, Digging, and he's looking out at his dad digging in the farm, in the field outside the window while he's writing his poetry. And, he's trying to compare what they're doing, in essence, they're laboring, they're uncovering, they're bringing air to soil, to what's buried underneath. But what can't be denied is the fact that one is so tangible, one is so visible, one is so like manly and active. And that kind of sense of a fear around the alleged invisibility and passivity of writing and of creating in this way, because the process isn't visible, and the outcomes, and we're so fond of outcomes these times in every arena, the outcomes aren't immediately apparent. And if you're sitting at a desk and you're writing, you might end up with nothing after 2 hours. Whereas if you dig a field, if you defend a case, if are at a shop all day, you will have sales. That there is this nervousness and danger again around the artist. So for Emily to be a woman and an artist, unmarried, defying all of these expectations, like almost like a powder keg that needed to be, contained within the safe walls of her family for her own protection, but indeed probably for the protection of the family and society at large. For what could she say or what could she do that could lead to all sorts of calamities?
And what about yourself? When you were thinking about writing, how old were you? What kind of support did or didn't you have?
I feel I was so very lucky because I grew up in a house where words and poems were just part of the everyday experience. My parents and all of my uncles and aunts grew up in a time where in Ireland, in primary school, in elementary school, and indeed onward, they were just expected to learn poems by heart. So they all had this wealth of learned off poetry from all different sorts of poets and a lot of Shakespeare, obviously, that they would just spout at various times as part of conversation when they were, giving out to me for doing something wrong. A quote from Shakespeare might emerge. So it was it was very ingrained and part of my upbringing, as well as I think going to mass regularly, going to Catholic mass every Sunday, and all of the trimmings. We did the whole thing, benediction, the Stations of the Cross, everything. But that language is so elevated and so dramatic and so awesome that was like what I was listening to every week growing up, learning off. And the repetition of that, obviously, over time, I think had a huge impact in like how I felt words and how I realized very early on that words were a key into understanding what was going on, because I was very confused when I arrived and remained so as to people's motivations, all of the things that are unsaid, all of these significant things like, why are we here? Is God real? When I was very little, and finding those answers, or finding at least attempts to engage with these questions in poetry. And I remember reading very early on. Yeats would have been a poet I was introduced to very early on. My mom was a great fan of Yeats and Wordsworth, and also obviously Shakespeare and Heaney, a lot of male poets initially, and going, oh, this is where it all happens. This is where the real stuff happens. And it was only when I went to secondary school, and things have changed very much now in our education system in terms of a balance of genders, but we didn't really learn very many women poets. And for my Leaving Cert course, Emily Dickinson was the only female poet on the course. And I remember we had a brilliant male teacher. He was astounding. I was very lucky with my teachers also. When he read her, he said, look, I don't really understand this poet. And that was just like the greatest. I was like, the teacher doesn't understand this poet. I think that was the beginning for me of an obsession with her and a fear of her and her unknowability, and the fact that she doesn't work to be understood, which is again something that I had been doing from a very early age. And so I started writing once I could hold a pen. Like, I was very invested. I was a baby poet from like 5. I was serious about it too. So she became, I suppose, my first blueprint for what a female poet might look like and might write like, and how different it was to Yeats or Kavanagh or Heaney. Or that was kind of the beginning for me. And then I suppose Sylvia Plath was like my next, all of the New England American poets was my next teacher a couple of years later. But Dickinson was definitely the gateway into the wonderful world of poetry written by women, shamefully late.
I just wonder if you see any patterns in who or how, when a writer will go on to make a strong impression, maybe beyond Dickinson as well, who have been the folks that have stuck? And do you think it had to do with timing, or did it have to do with who the person was that was doing the introducing? If we think about a mentor introducing a writer or a potential writer to someone else, that's already a conversation of 3.
The answer is so immediate for me. And it's of course, all of this is so very personal. There's a poet for everyone. You find your poets, you find your tribe. I was about 15 when I first read Emily Dickinson. And I think 15 is a very potent age anyway. But up until then, from as long as I can remember, and why I partially started writing and reading so much when I was so young, was the sense that I was incredibly sensitive. At that time, when I was deemed sensitive, because I was, and I am, that seemed like not a flaw per se, but a difficulty, like something that would make my life more difficult. And that while it was lovely that I was sensitive, and it brought many lovely gifts, equally, it was going to make things more difficult in terms of living in everyday life in this world that we live in. And so I needed to, no, I wouldn't go as far as saying toughen up, but needed to manage my sensitivity in a way that was safe for me and others. And obviously, when you're young and you're hearing that, or you're picking that up in the atmosphere in school, at home, everywhere, you don't have the maturity to be able to, see that this is something that maybe people don't necessarily understand and they're trying to help you. But it sounds like criticism and it sounds like judgment, because this is literally your sensibility. This is not something you can change. I'm so fascinated with the nervous system. It's something I've become very, very, very interested in over the last couple of years, and how we are nervous systems just covered with flesh. The whole body is designed to support the nervous system, which is what we ultimately are. And so that has given me such a different perspective on poets, on artists, because I do feel when I was 15, it felt like the nerves were on the outside of my body, but I had to try and pretend they weren't,
Yeah.
which was huge, took a huge effort. And it was places like my English classroom, my art classroom, where I felt I could slightly relax and allow that sensitivity be a positive, useful force in this scenario, because I didn't understand Emily Dickinson, but I understood Emily Dickinson. This is what I felt profoundly at 15. I didn't really understand the punctuation. I didn't necessarily understand so much of the context of her life at the time, but the passion I immediately understood, and the intensity I immediately understood. And while every 15-year-old, I think, in the history of the world is incredibly intense, I felt at the time like my intensity was almost unbearable at times. And then it was almost like, oh, I'm not alone in that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not alone in feeling like this is going to get the better of me, and that this mightn't be necessarily a problem if I can use it in the way it is designed to be used, which is channeling awareness. Look at this. You mightn't have noticed. Let me show you. Look at this feeling that you might be scared to feel. Let me hold it for you in this poem. And so she began to show me ways of containing this energy, I think, into these beautiful poem machines that she had constructed with her own immense, original, never to be seen again genius. Having a confidence, knowing that there is this person who exists, like a foremother, who has done this work.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I also love that you're talking not just about Dickinson as a literary ancestor, but as you say, as a foremother, as someone who is teaching you how to be, just simply how to be and how to be a person. This idea that we don't have to understand in the sense of wrestle a poem to the ground and analyze it line by line. It reminds me of how people so often want to superimpose a business model on artists or on artistic endeavors. The world is a big place. Can't we agree that there are different models, different ways? So, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for talking about her as instructions on just living and in stepping into who we might be. Well, I'd love to invite you to read your own poem that you brought.
It seems unfair to read my own poem after Emily Dickinson's poem, But I will anyway. So I dedicate this to Emily Dickinson for all of her influence and for paving the way for us all. Valentine poem for my Valentine. Surely by now you must be familiar with my heart's alarming habits, how it expands beyond the parameters of its rusty cage, how lumps of its slick muscle push through the bars in such an unsightly manner, all shiny and hot. I am ashamed of its size and hunger, yet still try to offer you its bloody chambers. At times, I quickly shove it in your pocket or satchel when you're not looking. Others, I sneak it into your tin cigarette box or lob it into the boot of your car as you drive away from me back to the city. What am I to do? Sometimes I even manage to balance it on the tiny freckle tucked into the palm of your hand. I've secreted it into envelopes, Friday night dinners, and maybe even into poems where it thumps clumsily behind tangible descriptions trying to mask its ooze and bulk. I have tried to hide the lumbering oaf that is my heart like this, thinking you would find it and see how careless I am with it, how free. Oh, what a grift. Because here I must come clean. I have wanted to tell you how desiccated it was, how it had been shrunk to the size of a screw top, dry and crumbling. I never, ever wanted to use it again. Do you understand? I thought I was dead and my pulse the sound of pebbles caving in on my chest like a grave. I didn't think it would be painful letting it grow again to the size of the whole world, that it would become a planet like this, that it would be where you live.
Thank you. Yeah. Ooh, so another poem of, I guess we could say hyperbole.
Yeah, we will.
All right, let's
We'll
say
say
it.
hyper. It's all exaggerated and very dramatic and not real.
I guess I use that term really just to describe the pylon
Of course.
of descriptions. You know, the bloody
Yes.
chambers, the slick muscle, the lumbering oaf, the ooze and bulk. I mean, these are amazing, wonderful, and relentless, which is something I admire very much in poetry. You know, no one's getting off the hook. It speaks to the pain of love in the same way that the Dickinson poem does. We have some M dashes going on here, of course, and both in direct address as well. And you already mentioned that desire to be understood and how that was something that propels your writing. And here we have this exact question almost to the end of the verse. Do you understand? It's something I like very much in your work, actually. Can you talk a little bit about the speaker of this poem?
I've come back to love poetry for various reasons. Obviously, one of the things that is written about most, but also the most difficult aspect of human experience, possibly to write about, of course, and particularly the nuance and slippy nature of romantic love. And I think for me, in trying to, again, understand myself in this arena, and particularly a new love as an adult, as someone with some experience in love and how it can go very wrong, and coming to a new love with a very tender, bruised heart, as so many of us do, as well as the original bruising of just being a child in the world. I think the relentlessness, I just love that you use that word, because I think that is exactly what poets are in their exploration of these kind of things. And I feel that that is something that I can lean towards in my personality, especially, and I'm trying to think of the word, uncovering is the word, uncovering these feelings and what they mean and where they come from and how they manifest and how they might change and what can I do about them, and trying to understand what a person in love might be experiencing through my physical body, my experiences. But that sense of trying to uncover what holds us back from love. I think that's what I am most fascinated by at the moment. Like, what barriers do we put in the way of being loved and loving? Reading this Dickinson poem, which I have long loved, I was thinking of this poem in a new way to how I had thought of it before when I had read it many years ago, because I was looking at that sense of maybe Emily Dickinson is like avoiding the real pain of love through her very dramatic, very like I'm too intense. Like it would be too much for us. We can't. We just can't. And having all of the reasons, like they're excellent, blasphemous, dramatic,
Yeah.
extreme reasons. And I'm sure the practical ones too. There were probably many of those. But equally, all of those are in some senses, as I read them now, smoke and mirrors. Because ultimately I'm like, Emily, are you afraid? Are you afraid of actually being quiet in this or allowing yourself be loved or allowing yourself to love? Are you afraid of the potency of your own capacity for love, of how giant your capacity for love is?
Because certainly the bigger it might be, the bigger the potential fall.
Exactly. And the possibility of enmeshment, losing yourself in that. Like imagine being Emily Dickinson. We can't, but having this language of your own, this way of being, this whole life that has been curated so carefully, and this person coming in to trouble that, and knowing the fear of, well, if I do proper, like whatever properly is, and or if I do commit to this person or I do live with this person, shall we say, in the context of this poem, what will I lose of myself? What will I lose of my work? What will I lose of my language? As well as, will I be able to contain this love? Will it be healthy love? They didn't have words like codependent back then, but will it be that kind of all-consuming love that will burn out, as you say, very quickly in the everyday cut and thrust of, minding your physical body and keeping the house in order? I wondered about that in this revisiting of this poem. And I am wondering about all of this in my own work, being someone who is of the more passionate, romantic disposition. How do you navigate that and manage that in yourself in a world that commodifies that and absolutely puts that on the pedestal of human love? But yet there isn't really the same attention given to what happens after. And what I'm beginning to understand, I suppose, belatedly, is that the after is very quiet. And so it doesn't have the drama and the potency and the electricity in the same way that is obvious in that early form of love. And I'm fascinated in that transition.
Yeah, I mean, in a world that, of course, could always use more love, real love, a lot of love, it feels like the poems have the opportunity, if we let it into our everyday lives, they could be, as you said earlier, the elevated language, like that is the ritualistic piece, they could bring the drama to what is in fact the common day, the quiet. Maybe you could talk a little bit about intention balanced with just what is up for us in our personal lives, what we are writing about because that's what is there to write about for us. And how much does the bigger world enter for you? How much does it direct? So coming back to love poetry seems like a wonderful thing to be doing right now in a very broken world. But is it just circumstantial?
I think love is always radical, isn't it? Like real love. And no matter how no matter what form it takes in terms of all of the different hues and beautiful manifestations of love, it's always a radical act because it is essentially listening to your ego and saying, no, I am going to transcend you right now. Early stages of love, I suppose, are egoic, like the limerence and this, because it's all about how the other person is making you feel, or how the idea of the other person is making you feel, or the all of the hormones, the dopamine and all of these other wonderful chemicals going off in your brain in order for you to bond with this person. Ultimately, it comes down to, can I get over myself? Actually, maybe what is better is, can I get through myself? Can I go through myself to meet myself in another person? Because so often other people become mirrors of what we don't like in ourselves, or what we're grappling with in ourselves, or what is unresolved in ourselves. So, when you're not in relationship, you're like, oh, well, I've really got everything together and I'm a grown up. I'm an adult human person. And then the minute you are in relationship with someone else, you go home for Christmas or you meet your sister, you stay a couple of nights with your sister and suddenly you're fighting over clothes. Or, you meet this person, this new romantic interest, and in a couple of years, suddenly all of your worst qualities come roaring back and you're suddenly like, I feel like I'm 5 or I feel like I'm 15 because all of these unresolved moments come up. And I think with poets like Dickinson, like Plath, like so many others, well, it's always an attempt to make the mundane magical and special because we are so lucky to be here. We are so lucky to be alive. Whatever type of life we're having, it is a privilege. And I say that obviously there are people going through horrific hardships, but there is something in that being here. Being here is something immense that I don't know if we fully can even understand because we are a manifestation of time, a manifestation of life loving itself. And the connection we have with another is just is an example of the connection we have with everybody, but that's so overwhelming for our sense of self. But I think that the poet is a channel for what is important at the bottom, as my dad used to say, the bottom line of life. What is the real challenge in being human? And it is to love and be loved. It is to grow. It is to suffer. And through that suffering, learn and help and be of service and connect. And I think the channeling that Emily Dickinson does with her suffering, and what a gift that she was able to transmute that into spells and incantations and instructions for how to manage being a human and retain your humanity and keep your heart open. And I think that is the huge challenge to us all now in a world where everything hurts. The mess of humanity, like making a poem is messy, it's painful, it's awkward, it goes wrong, it's embarrassing, it's difficult. But that is the whole point, because at the end, there is a poem and somebody needs that poem. Maybe only one person, maybe only the poet.
What new projects are you working on?
Writing these love poems and writing about love again is really what my project is at the moment.
Not just love poems, but poems about love, which is kind of different.
Absolutely, both of them and all of them.
Well, Victoria Kennefick, thank you so much. This has been so fun, and I feel like we could talk for a really long time.
Thank you so much. We could talk forever.
Thanks for being with us today for Melody or Witchcraft. You can find out more about today's guest by going to victoriakennefick.com. That surname is KENNEFICK.com. Our theme music is by Emma Wallace. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple, among other places. For the complete show notes, however, go to the Substack app and the Ask the Poet Substack. Please comment, like, restack, recommend. We'd love to hear from you.